Hello, hello. Welcome to the Drupal 7 End of Life podcast. I am Mark Dorson, Chromatic CTO, joined today by our CEO, Dave Look. And today we're going to talk about RFPs. What are they good for? No, but what really makes for a good RFP when we're talking about moving from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9? I feel like this is RFP season for sites that are still on Drupal 7, especially with the extension of the Drupal 7 end of life date. Now, companies and organizations are feeling more confident about when end of life is truly going to come. And they are able to start thinking with enough lead time now to say, okay, this is the moment. Now is the moment to issue these RFPs, start talking to folks. And so we're starting to see more of them. So we wanted to take some time because we've seen it all. We've seen the good ones, we've seen the bad ones, and everything in between. So, Dave, where would you even start when we're thinking about what makes for a good RFP generally, or a good RFP specifically for a Drupal 7 upgrade migration?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to be back on, and hopefully this is a value add episode. I think the RFP process is painful for most people, but there are ways to make it better. A very simple thing is make the RFP as detailed as possible and provide as much information as possible. Now, I understand every organization is different. The way you issue RFPs, if you're a government organization, there's specific channels and templates that have to be used. So some of this is not necessarily going to be a perfect fit for every org, but there's things that I think will help everyone. So high level, we have two different. One thing that's very helpful in this case, if we're talking specifically about a Drupal 7 upgrade to Drupal 9 or Drupal 10, and that is that you already know the content management system you're starting with and that you're going to. So that's a huge piece of information. So we see a lot of RFPs that are, hey, we need a new content management system. But when somebody asks that question or puts out an RFP for a new content management system without specifying whether they want Drupal or WordPress or Adobe Expression Engine or whatever, Experience Manager, that's sort of like saying, hey, Mark, I want you to build me a house. Can you tell me how much it costs and how long it's going to take? And there's probably a few more details that you need to know before you could answer that question. So the less information you have, the higher likelihood that everybody that responds is going to say, you need to do a discovery. And even in the Drupal 7 upgrade scenario, you might need a discovery, or you might need a shortened version of a discovery because you know some more information. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But I think that idea of trying to define the project as clearly as you can up front is really important. And not to get too far ahead, but with the timeline of Drupal 7 end of life, you have enough time to issue a discovery RFP and do a discovery as a specific project, and then issue a full build RFP if you don't want to work with the same vendor. So I think there's a lot of opportunity with this current space. I think I kind of covered the generic thing on RFPs there, but in terms of providing as much detail as possible, one thing in this scenario, like I said, is that we know we're going from Drupal 7 to modern Drupal. So I think, Mark, as our CTO, you might be able to explain some of the known things that would be able to be included from a technical standpoint, either as requirements or an appendix, but saying this is the stuff we know about our current system in Drupal 7 and what we're hoping to do in Drupal 9 or Drupal 10.
Yeah, I think too, if we think about this as like you threw out an option of doing a discovery and then issuing an RFP for the actual, migration project, upgrade project. I'm thinking about, okay, if we've done a good discovery, what are the kinds of things that we now know that we're able to include in this RFP? So if you think, oh, I don't need a discovery, we know all these things, like, you know, we know what we need. Well, then all that info that, you know, that you're confident that you know, that should be in the RFP. I think you want to provide as much detail as possible, so so you can get confident responses and you can have confidence in the responses. But on the technical side, I'm thinking about, you know, is this a single site or is this a multi-site or a platform, multiple sites running off of a single code base? How many and what are the contributed modules that are in use? How many of those contributed modules could potentially be removed? You know, in almost every, you know, big upgrade project that we're looking at, there's typically a whole subset of modules that were installed and useful at one point, and they're no longer, maybe they're still enabled, but they're no longer actively used, or at least they're used at a small enough degree that folks want to take those things out and remove the maintenance overhead and burden. You know, how many of those contributed modules that are staying around, how many of them have Drupal 10 ready releases? There's been a lot of movement in contrib space lately around getting Drupal 10 releases out the door. So that's in much better shape than it was a few months ago, but you still want to, you know, cross your T's and dot your I's there. And then custom code, you know, how much custom code, how many modules, how complex. This is where it's really, it's a little bit more qualitative than quantitative. So it tells you something if someone says, oh, I have 2 custom modules or I have 50, but you could have technically have 2 custom modules that just have hundreds of thousands of lines of code in them.
Right.
That's probably a big code smell, but it's technically possible. So, you know, some understanding of how much custom code is in play, whether it's number of modules, number of lines of code, what that, you know, code is intending to do from a business perspective, like what are the features that this enables?
Right.
Similar thing with theme. You know, how many templates are we looking at? You know, different types of templates that are in play. How intricate and complicated is the theme? Is it simply overriding some styles, or do we have very intricate markup and templates that need to be moved to a twig theme? Content types, again, number, complexity, any like call outs as far as like, you know, things that are unique or special.
Number of items of content, probably too.
Number of items of content per content type. This is another area where we frequently see, oh, we've got 30 content types, but we only frequently use 8 of them.
Right.
How many of those remaining ones could be deprecated and removed as part of the transition? You know, and what do we do with that data? Do we want to preserve it in some way outside of the web system? Like that would be super valuable to understand, you know, at the beginning of a project when we're looking at an RFP.
Right.
Any third-party tools or integrations that are in use. So what APIs are in active use, either through contrib modules or custom code, or even in the theme, if there's things that are being placed on the page, you know, that need to be accounted for, or, you know, again, potentially be removed. Hey, we installed this JavaScript, you know, tool years ago, and gosh, we forgot about it. I forgot that was still there, but it's, you know, weighing the page
we're paying
down.
for it.
Yeah. And we're slowing down the page for our users. Let's take this opportunity to get it out. So this is the moment to take stock in all those things. Database versions and size, same thing with like PHP version and the other tool versions, like if you're using Redis or Memcache. Search, you know, if you're what search tool you're using, what versions, and then information about, you know, your DevOps workflows, you know, just sort of like the day-to-day, well, how do we commit code? what is our process? What's our deployment process? What's our testing process? So is there anything automated that runs on pull requests? Is there anything, what pieces of deployment are automated or scripted? And then hosting details for similar reasons, versions of infrastructure, how it's controlled. Is it something that's manually configured? Is it configured with a YAML file? All of these things are questions that we're going to be asking if it's not in the RFP.
Right.
So the great RFP, the best RFP that we can imagine, has a lot of these details or even all of these details already in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even if it's not necessarily the first page of the RFP, it's just included as an appendix or
absolutely
link to documentation, things like that. Any bit of information that can be provided up front is extremely helpful. Typically, at the beginning of these projects, any project, you know the least amount about the project when you're starting. So you're being asked to tell me how much this is going to cost and how long it's going to take. But I really don't have the information to answer that without getting all of these details, especially in this case. So
you mentioned how much it's going to cost. What do you think about, whether it's overall budget or whether it's questions about how much different pieces are going to cost? What do you advise folks writing an RFP? How should they think about how they should think about and write about, talk about the dollars and cents?
Yeah. So let me go one step back and say, here's some things that I think should be included in every RFP, just in general. You need to have the background of your organization, the scope of the project, those basic details of what you're asking for. That's going to be standard in any request for proposal. List your goals, but really only if they're measurable, actionable, trackable goals. So something like a successful launch of the site, well, that's kind of given in the project title. So if you have more details that say something like, we're going to launch the site with no latency, no downtime, a one-to-one upgrade, those types of goals are very helpful. List your team, how big the team is that we or another agency would be working with, who's making decisions, what that flow is going to look like. All of those types of structural items are really important. In terms of budget, we get this a lot, and we see a lot of RFPs that have no budget listed. And sometimes we go, there's no budget, we're not even going to respond. And I think there's a lot of agencies that are in that boat. However, I think there is this fear of putting a budget, in some cases, into this RFP because you're sort of going first and you're price anchoring, right? What were you going to say, Mark?
Can you explain why you think people don't want to put a budget?
I think they are afraid.
Not clear.
Yeah, I think that most of it has to do with either negotiating or fear that someone is going to just take advantage, that they have say they have $200,000 of budget and they list that, but really the project could be done for 100 and they're going, well, we could save 100,000 and build something else new. So we're just going to let everybody apply blind and hopefully enough people come in a budget that's 100K or under our total budget. The other side is they might not actually have a budget approved and they don't know what the project's going to cost. So they say, hey, let's get 10 agencies to respond. And if there's one for 50,000 and 8 of them come in at 150,000 and there's one for 250,000, well, we can just take that middle of the range and go, that's probably what this project's going to cost. Now, that is an acceptable way to do this. However, what we have found is the most successful is to say, hey, I have $150,000 of budget. And then we can go, well, this is what can be done with that. Because if the budget is significantly fixed, you're going to have to be selective with the scope that you actually develop and deploy. And there might be things like you already mentioned, hey, we have 10 modules that we might not need or that could be done in a different way. So all of those types of decisions can be decided around what's the best use of these dollars to get the highest return on the investment. And we talk about this with clients all the time, which is we're not trying to suck money out of you. We're trying to give you the best product possible for the money that you have. And I think there's a very big difference in that. But again, you might not know your budget, and that therefore you're just trying to see, hey, what is everybody saying this is going to cost?
I think it probably depends too on how an organization wants to pay for the project and how an agency or another organization wants to charge, how they want to bill for the project.
For sure.
So if an organization is expecting it to be sort of a fixed fee project, like this is how much money I have, whether they're saying it or not, they have a number in their head maybe. And they want to budget for that and know that it's a little bit different than if they're looking at it and saying like, well, we want to work with someone on more of a time and materials basis. And if we can get things done more quickly, great. We have time to go even further into the backlog under the roadmap and still hit our budget, which is a different way to think about it and approach it when you're writing the RFP or when you're responding to the RFP. So do you think it's important for an author of an RFP to include that, like what their expectations are as far as the type of engagement?
I think it is helpful. It is not always required, but I try to remind everybody that this is software development. So if I own a building and I need a new parking lot and I need somebody I want to put it out to RFP, I can say, here's the dimensions of my parking lot. Tell me how much this is going to cost. I can get 3 bids.
Right. And I'm responding to it. And I'm like, I've done 10,000 parking lots and I've done 100 that are exactly this dimension. So I can pretty confidently tell you what it's going to cost.
Exactly. And you can make a very clear decision. This is not quite the same. As you know, it is very complex, especially if you have a large custom application that's built on Drupal 7. And your point about the module, maybe you have 2 modules, but they have so much business logic in them that it's going to take hundreds or thousands of hours to translate that business logic into modern Drupal code. So it's just not, sometimes it's very difficult to say it's going to take this exact amount of time or this exact amount of dollars, which is why working in an agile methodology for this type of work is a lot better. Now, it's not to say a simple site can't have a fixed bid and you can't get it done within that timeline and that budget. It happens all the time. But the more flexible you can be, the better the project is going to run, at least in our experience, with complicated sites. The other thing I would remind people is when you put price out there, reputable firms are going to be honest with you. So we have had RFPs that listed budgets that said, we have $450,000. And we said, well, actually, we can probably get a long way on your project for $300. And if there's other features that we can develop for that other $150, let's do that. And they appreciate that. Or on the other hand, we've had places where there's no budget listed and we say, hey, we think this is going to be about 150, maybe it's 200,000, and there's no response. And then we lose on price because they only had 50 grand and they could have just told us that up front and saved everyone the time of creating the proposal response and even the time to evaluate it. So I think it helps both sides of the equation because you who are issuing the RFP aren't getting a bunch of proposals that are totally inaccurate to what you're asking for or expecting. And it saves the agencies that are responding time because they know what the target is. If your organization does not allow that, give some sort of size indicator. This might not work because it wouldn't necessarily be universal, but A friend of ours, Joe Rinaldi, used to talk about things in size of Star Wars ships. So is it a little TIE fighter? Is it the Millennium Falcon? Or is it the Death Star? So are you talking very small, medium-sized, or large-sized project? And even that is enough to start to gauge, is this a $50,000 project, a $200,000 project, or a $500,000 project? And that kind of indicator would help people and help get the RFP dialed in a way that makes sense. My last comment on that is, if you really have no clue what you should be spending on this, think about the amount of time it's going to take. So you might not know exactly, but guesstimate. If you're putting out an RFP, you probably have a launch timeline and a start date. So let's say it's 4 months. Well, let's think about a 4-month project, minimum of 2 people working on it at 30 hours a week at a reasonable hourly rate of $175 to $225 an hour. Well, that 4 months is going to be $126,000 to $162,000. So right there, you can say, hey, our project's probably $150,000, and we could put that in our RFP, and we'll get people responding within the range that we're expecting.
I think, the pricing bit always comes down to trust too. It's, if you're writing the RFP and getting responses from folks, they're trying to earn your trust, and, and that's essential, I think, to getting to the point where you feel confident in awarding a project and saying, yeah, I'm buying what you're selling, literally. Because especially in our work, there's always somebody cheaper out there. There's always someone that you could get a cheaper price for, especially upfront. The problem is you're going to pay for it one way or another. So the question is like, well, can they deliver on that? And I think we've seen that too. And this is always a challenge. So I think what I feel when talking about this is going back to just like getting as much information out as early in the process as possible, because as someone who's frequently responding to RFPs, confidence is often the problem. Like, we don't have enough information to be confident yet in our, estimates, and we know the least amount we're ever going to know, in the life of the project. So I think that kind of is the cycle that can be, that can end up moving in both directions. So the more information that is in the RFP, that's going to help with a responder's confidence. And the more confidence they have and the more detail then that they can put in their response, that's going to hopefully earn trust with the person, receiving the proposal, reading the proposal, evaluating it. So that's my overall theme that I think about when I think about a great RFP.
That's a really great point. And I think that's one of the hard parts about both issuing an RFP and responding to them, is that you will inevitably have on either side a trust gap. So whatever you can do to fill that is important. One thing I would ask you, Mark, is sometimes we get asked to say, hey, can you line item this as a cost per feature or cost per requirement? I tend to say that that's not really possible. I know that it is in some cases, but could you maybe unpack why it's hard to do that in some cases technically?
Well, I think it gets more difficult the more specific and the down the tree you get. And the reason it gets more difficult is because the confidence starts to go down. So when we start at the very top level, the entire project already, like I just said, our confidence is not, at a high level at this stage. We know so little about the project. If it's not an amazing RFP, maybe we don't have even half or barely any of some of the information that we've described here. So you're doing your best to get some kind of big number. But then when you start breaking things down, now your confidence level goes even lower because you're getting more specific. And let's say you've broken it up into 10 buckets. Well, I have more confidence in the overall bucket than I do any one of the 10 individual buckets. You add them
Right.
all up and they equal the top number. Why is my confidence lower? Am I going to hit those individual ones? I don't know, even if I'm pretty confident I can hit the overall bucket. And what that means is that, well, bucket A, that might end up being way more complicated than we expected. But that happens on every project. There's always going to be some area that's more complicated than you expect. But hopefully there's another bucket somewhere over on the other end that actually ends up being more straightforward than you expect.
Right.
So we're going to, end up saying, well, that took half the time and this one took more than we expected, but you move some of that time over and hey, we're still on target for the overall, our overall estimate. So, that's at like a 1 splitting up into 10 buckets. Now, if you try to split those up into even smaller buckets, it just, the challenge grows exponentially. So, it's very hard to have even close to the same level of confidence once you start slicing things up into their sub parts.
Yeah, I think that's great. The other thought I had on that is that I hate to use the words you get something for free, because we know that you get stuff for free or out of the box with Drupal. So Drupal has search included. So we should assume we're going to have search in the system. So there's no real way to line item what search costs. Now, installing Solar or Elasticsearch or one of those and configuring a really custom, robust search engine, sure, there might be a way to line item that. But really, a lot of these features start to get so intertwined that building one might result in another. And so specific requirements get a little hazy to where if you actually wanted to line item them, each one, the scope of the project actually gets bigger, because if you take that thing out, the amount of time it takes to build something else goes up. So it's sort of a artful dance to get to that big number and that confident number that you're talking about. So I think another thing to think about is that requirement in an RFP for software development can be difficult. Now, there are things that can be line itemed in that way or estimated in a way and said, all right, well, we're going to skip doing that thing. But that requires the nuance of a conversation to define what those features are actually doing or what you mean by certain requirements.
So if folks have made it this far, I'll add that, if you're at a point where you have a Drupal 7 migration that you need to do, or you're at a point where you're preparing to write an RFP, Chromatic is offering a free working session for Drupal 7 folks with Drupal 7 sites, where we go through some of these individual items. It's a bit of a mini discovery, and that data can be used in writing your RFP, or however you want to use it, really. But that info is going to be available. There's going to be a link in the show notes that you'll be able to find a link to sign up for a free Drupal 7 working session. Dave, anything else to add?
I have a bunch of other thoughts on the RFP. So a couple other things that I would recommend including. So timeline for your decision-making and communication plan. One thing that I think is, I understand not every organization can do this, but if you're going to issue an RFP, I think it is the common courtesy thing to do to give everybody clear communication about your decision or when somebody's out, all of those type of things. But we've seen in some RFPs where they say specifically, we'll notify you on this date, whether you're in or out, and getting those notifications are great as a vendor. I already mentioned fixed fee, time and materials, agile methodology. Anything you have around that would be helpful. The process and dates for launch, and specifically around launch, is there something driving that launch date? So I think that's something that gets kind of left out. There's a lot of times like we would like to launch by January 17th. Well, that's a very specific date. Is there something happening on January 25th that we need to know about?
Right.
Those types of things are helpful. And then generally, I've noticed recently in a handful of RFPs what I would call a lack of precision of language. So using precise language will help somebody be able to come up with an estimate to the best of the ability. So an example is in a recent RFP, it said a requirement was robust search feature. Well, the site that they were coming from was not built on a content management system, and their search is sort of piecemealed between a filter and a search and a couple other things. Well, is a robust search feature just unified search across the site? Or is there something that could be more specific, which is saying we want all of our content indexed. We want that to include PDFs. We want to display authenticated versus non-authenticated content in our search results. And we want it to be faceted. That is a very robust search feature that
I can do it on Google. Why can't I do it on my site?
Amazon? I just want the search feature like Amazon. I can't remember who was that. It doesn't matter. I won't name names, but some client asked us for a search feature like Amazon. We're like, well, that's going to be kind of expensive.
You need an Amazon level investment for that.
I remember the call now. That was a good one. Other language that I think could be more precise, I've seen enhanced feature X or improved feature Y. What does enhance mean? What does improved mean?
Right.
Be as specific as you can with those requirements. And if you don't have them, that's what a discovery is for. That's what a consultation with an agency is for, to help define those things. Like Mark said, we in 45 minutes, we can't get it all, but we can get you a long way there. The last bit is to just watch out for contradictions in your RFP. I've seen this again recently, which is under a requirement, then the language nice to have. Well, as I'm trying to estimate or give you a proposal, I don't know if it's a requirement that you have the ability to get this feature. If the requirement is that that feature is part of the proposal, if nice to have means have to have. So it's just kind of it's a small thing, but as you're trying to analyze and give somebody something that's specific and actionable and that they can make a decision on, that's a place that creates confusion. So just being as clear as you can with those types of things. Lastly, some things that I've seen in RFPs over the years that I would recommend not including is legal language. Certainly you can put something in there about we're not going to pay you to respond to the RFP. We see that often. Yeah, but I've also seen NDAs kind of slipped into the RFP. I've seen non-solicits. Like you have to like respond and sign a form to reply to the RFP, and there's some stuff in there that can be a little jarring. So I would recommend if you require an NDA or you require those things, do that as a separate document from your RFP and let that go through a proper legal process. Same thing if you want to see terms and conditions or a master services agreement or something, ask for that as a separate document, not as part of your proposal. A proposal and a contract should definitely be separate, but go talk to Matchstick Legal about that if you need more information. So I think that's it. I think that's my list of recommendations on RFPs. There's probably more. I have a lot of opinions about it, but those
is an amazing place to start. So again, link in the show notes for the free Drupal 7 working session. Send us RFP questions. If you have questions, we'll get them to Dave. And
actually, I would be happy to. I have helped a couple agencies or organizations get their RFPs dialed in, and I think it's led to successful projects. So I would be more than happy to do that.
There you go. All right. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Have a good day.